Hello, my name is Olorotimi Osha. Today is May the 17th, 2026, and today I want to discuss the only time we've had a United States Attorney General uh, become a guest of the state. That's an involuntary guest of the state. I'm not talking about the like the state honors we gave King Charles III recently. This may as well, right? It's not a state visit. This is an involuntary guest of the state. That's i.e., incarcerated by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which is under the Department of Justice. So it's ironic that the head of the Department of Justice was actually incarcerated, and it's only happened once in our history. And of course, he was involved with the president. He was his principal was the time. We've had a president who's resigned, right? The only president ever to resign, and that's Richard Nixon. And of course, he was Attorney General under Richard Nixon. And of course, the reason for his imprisonment, its conviction, and eventual imprisonment at the in Montgomery County at the Maxwell Air Force Base, where federal prison there, was of course it had to do with a scandal that had a nomenclature ending with gate. Of course, that's a Watergate scandal. Um, I'm going to do a timeline and discuss the Watergate scandal because it's very it's very consequential in U.S. history. Today, I decided to discuss John Mitchell because it doesn't come up. People don't talk about it. But because someone like me, I'm a lawyer, again, this doesn't constitute legal advice. I'm a lawyer, not an attorney. I have a video on that, right? And I'll probably do a second video on that for those who just didn't get it. Because there's some people that I've met, you can explain to them so many times that a lawyer is not necessarily an attorney, even though all attorneys are lawyers. But, I'm a lawyer, not an attorney. But some people still won't get it. But in any event, of course, it's very important because you have a character requirement, character and fitness requirement, character and fitness test to be called to the bar. So after you take the bar exam, after you graduate from law school, lawyers want to have somebody who is not just intellectually qualified, right? Passes exams, but somebody who's also morally appropriate. They're morally fit, and yeah, because law is actually a profession that it's not just dealing with empirical fitness, existential fitness, but also has a normative value. There's a normative factor. That's value judgment, normative factor. So you have a character component, and so the body of lawyers, they determine, okay, can you be one of us or not be one of us? So that's another main reason why lawyers, even if they don't want to practice, if they don't want to go to court, right? Um, they still want to be officers of the court and be a body, be a licensed attorney because it says something. It says that they do have the normative quality. They pass the normative bar. They have the character and fitness, right? They have the moral soundness, and their community of lawyers approve of them, right? So even if they're not going to courts, right? Even if that's not their objective. Now, John Newton Mitchell he didn't go to court. His job was a transactional attorney, right? Because he was actually a municipal bond lawyer. So it's interesting that um, he devised a form of municipal bonds that I studied in accounting school, in business school. Before I went to law school, I got an undergraduate in accounting, right? I did an undergraduate major in accounting and had an MBA. And I took a course in governmental accounting. And so you learn about the accounting for moral obligation bonds. So John Mitchell is responsible for having he invented this moral obligation bonds because he was a mutual fund. Sorry, he was a municipal bond lawyer. So municipal bond lawyer in New York. So that's of course that meant that uh, he was sort of an investment banking lawyer, but it depended on what he was doing. So investment bankers, of course, they raise money, they can develop securities, they can create securities. And as a municipal bond lawyer, right, his job would have been to, it could have been to be an advisor, right, uh, to the investment bank to make sure that they were in compliance and regulation, followed regulation in terms of SEC, right, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which and so on and so forth. I've done a video discussing those things that came up. The SEC that was created under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right, in the aftermath of the Great Depression. But I'm not going to get into the technical details of the sort of work that John Mitchell did as a lawyer. But basically, I'm just pointing out that um, he was a licensed attorney, but he didn't go to court. He wasn't a lawyer that appeared in court. He was a transactional attorney, and so it's kind of ironic that even though that was what he did, he was picked by Nixon to become Attorney General of the United States, and of course he remains the only U.S. Attorney General to have been convicted of a crime for crimes he committed while in office and to have gone to prison for it. He spent 19 months in prison. Um, so let me give us just a little bit about his background and how he got to be associated with Richard Nixon. Of course, he was born in 1913, September 15, 1913. So he was in his 50s when he became U.S. Attorney General in 1969. He had run Richard Nixon's campaign. He ran Richard Nixon's campaign for 1968. Of course, we know Richard Nixon had been defeated in his contest against John F. Kennedy. He had been vice president to Eisenhower. That's Richard Nixon, but he lost narrowly, very narrowly, just by less than 150,000 votes to John F. Kennedy. And he was never happy about it, but he went back into private practice. He went into the practice of law, and along the way his law firm and the law firm that John Newton Mitchell worked for would merge, right? They'd merge, and of course they became very close associates, and Richard Nixon tapped him to run his 1968 presidential campaign, which was successful, right? And after it was successful, so that's John Newton. He ran John Newton Mitchell. That is, he managed. It was a campaign manager for Richard Nixon for his 1968 presidential campaign. And when that was successful, Richard Nixon made him his uh, the U.S. Attorney General. So he became the 67th U.S. Attorney General. Now, his tenure as Attorney General was a mixed bag, right? So were there signs that this guy, uh, was going to be the first and only convicted U.S. Attorney General? Well, there are signs in his maybe in his earlier life. So he served in the U.S. Navy. He served in the U.S. Navy, and he claimed to have been the commanding officer of John F. Kennedy. Right? He claimed he got a Purple Heart. He claimed that he got a Silver Star. It turned out all of these things were false, right? He made a lot of false statements about his time serving in World War II. He did serve, but he didn't receive a Purple Heart. He didn't receive um, a Silver Star. He wasn't JFK's commanding officer. So that's actually a crime now. But that the crime that the law that criminalized what's called stolen valor. That's a Stolen Valor Act. It didn't come up until 2013, right? So today, if you're claiming that you served in the military and you didn't, it's actually a federal crime. You go to prison for it. It's a violation of the Stolen Valor Act. If you're claiming that you're a general and you're not, right, in the U.S. Army, it's Stolen Valor Act. If you're claiming that you won a Purple Heart, like John Mitchell was claiming, or won a Silver Star, like John Mitchell claimed, that's stolen valor. It violates the Stolen Valor Acts of 2013, and you could go to prison for it. But that law didn't exist then. So in any event, it tells us something about his character, that he would lie, he would cheat, and things like that. Um, so in any event, he goes to law school. He graduated from Fordham University Law School. I was actually accepted at Fordham University Law School, but I didn't go in New York. Um, I'm happy about the law school I went to, by the way. I graduated from George Washington University Law School. It's a very good government law school, and we're located right next to the White House, right? So it was a good experience for me. But back to the story of John Mitchell. So he graduated um, from Fordham University Law School, and at some point he's tapped by Richard Nixon as U.S. Attorney General. What did he do as U.S. Attorney General? There's several things he did wrong as U.S. Attorney General, and maybe some things he might have done right, or maybe President Nixon did right. Let me start with what he did right. It was under uh, it was under uh, Attorney General John Mitchell that desegregation was sped up. Right? The process of desegregation was moved on expeditiously, right, and it was almost fully consummated by in 1968, prior to Richard Nixon taking office. Um, about how many percent? Over 80% of blacks still attended, um, about 70%, over 70% of blacks still attended segregated schools. 70 to 80% of blacks still attended segregated schools. Um, and that's because even though Brown versus Board of Education had been passed, had become the law, saying that segregation of public schools was illegal, so overturning Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, which said separate was equal. Uh, the courts came back, this was in 1954, but the courts came back in 1955 saying, well, since it's a complicated thing, and this is, the institution, the institutions had always been segregated. The country had always been, at least the South had always been segregated. That the process of desegregation should move on with all deliberate speed. Right. That's if you consider it, that's basically saying that you can move in haste slowly, right? Move in haste slowly. That's what all deliberate speed means. So that's a euphemism. It's an oxymoron, right? It's moving in haste slowly. It's a oxymoron, and so that's why desegregation had not yet been, or integration had not yet been accomplished in the public schools. 14 years after Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus Board of Education became law in 1954. But as of 1968, over 70 to 80% black students still attended segregated schools. But by 1972, right, when by the time John Mitchell resigned to become chairman of the committee to re-elect the uh, president, that's chairman of Richard Nixon's 1972 presidential elections, campaign for to re-elect Richard Nixon. By the time he he left the U.S. Attorney General's position to be chairman of the acronym, by the way, was CREEP, right? Committee to Re-elect the President. It was called CREEP by the press. Um, Only 8%, right? Only 8% of blacks still attended segregated schools by that time in 1972. So you see, there was tremendous progress that was made in those in how many years? 3 years, from 80% in 1968, to um, 8% in uh, that's over 70% in 1968 to just to about 8%, 8 on the 10% in 1972. So that was the positive, right? That was the positive. And I guess Nixon doesn't get credit for that. Nixon instead is often censured for the other atrocities that the Attorney General, that's John Mitchell, committed. He was known as the Law and Order Attorney General. Of course, he it was the time of the student uprisings, the protests, mass protests against Vietnam, right? And Richard Nixon, of course, had come into office promising that he was going to, end the Vietnam War, but he didn't. He actually escalated the Vietnam War secretly, and so uh, what's the fallout, right? The response of the Attorney General John Mitchell was to clamp down heavily on the protests, and he encouraged, the no knock warrants, right? A lot of civil and then other civil rights violations, right? And he was tough on what he called crime. He likened the students to Nazi brown shirts, and his wife Martha, that's the wife of Martha Mitchell. By the way, I'll do another video and talk more about the kidnapping of how he got the FBI to kidnap his wife to keep her silent, because his wife was in the habit of calling journalists during the Watergate scandal and just trying to giving them tips and trying to basically absolve her husband, but she just ended up implicating him more, right? And she did disclose that he likened the students uh, to the anarchists, the Marxists in the Bolshevik Revolution. So uh, clearly, the Justice Department under John Mitchell came down heavily against the student protests, right? And there are all these mass arrests and still lots of civil rights violations. And he was against the what he called the Black Power movement and things like that. So there are lots of civil rights violations under him. And he, of course, expanded the wiretapping and illegal wiretapping, mass surveillance, because he was likening the environment to a state of anarchy and, to Russian revolutionaries. And of course, um, that's part of how he got in trouble, right? He ended up, of course, being convicted for obstruction of justice. Um, that's with regard to his involvement with the Watergate affair. Apparently, he authorized the Watergate bugging, right? So, obstruction of justice, perjury, and for conspiracy, right? Conspiracy to cover up the Watergate scandal. So those are the three things he was convicted of: obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and perjury. Now, prior to that, there was something else he did. So there was a guy who he had a litany of atrocities, right? There was a fugitive, right, who was known as an international financier, but he was really a drug smuggler. He had been in investment banking, wasn't educated, but he was an investment banker, and he made money through his shady dealings. And his name was Robert L. Vesco. And so he was wanted for violations, fraud, and things like that. He had been indicted by the federal government, and so he he was in flight. He escaped the country, and it is eventually what's his name was indicted. That's John Mitchell. John Mitchell was in 1973 or so. He was indicted for obstructing justice, right? So after this guy, this fugitive from the law, Robert L. Vesco, deposited, contributed $200,000 to the campaign of Richard Nixon, right? Which John Mitchell managed, right? John Mitchell was in charge of Richard Nixon's campaign. So he was a money man. Of course, he was a transactional lawyer, right? A Wall Street lawyer, and so he was the one who was controlling the money. Now, his wife would reveal that in the re-election campaign in 1972, which he managed, that's John Mitchell. He would eventually resign as Attorney General so he could focus as chairman of the uh, Nixon 1972 campaign. His wife said that Nixon won that election in a landslide because of all the dirty tricks that the campaign used, right? And so there was this slush fund money, right? There was a slush fund money which he managed, right? Uh, that's for the campaign of Richard Nixon. In apparently, in order to use the funds to hire operatives to sabotage Democratic candidates, sabotage them, and to smear them. And of course, that's how the Watergate bugging came around, right? So the Watergate scandal, that was where um, members of um, members of what was called as what were nicknamed as the White House plumbers. They were the plumbers. They were a White House Special Investigations Unit. Their objective was one to plug up, right, to sabotage routes, find out people who were leaking information to the press, right? They came about because of the Pentagon Papers. I've done videos explaining the Pentagon Papers, and subsequently they got involved in other things. One of them, G. Gordon Liddy, came out from, he was drafted out of the plumbers group, that's the White House Special Investigations Unit, and then he was assigned under John Mitchell to work with the committee to re-elect the president, CREEP, right? CREEP, which John Mitchell was managing. And he was authorized to get in to use illegal wiretapping to bug offices. And so it said that it was John Mitchell who authorized the secret bugging of the Watergate complex. Incidentally, John Mitchell and his wife, they actually got a place in the Watergate complex, right? For $140,000, right? $140,000. That's the equivalent of $1,270,000 today, right? So it was $140,000 then. So you can understand how upscale the Watergate was. So it's the people normally call it a hotel, but it had a hotel in it, but it was a multi-purpose complex, right? It had offices, it had apartments where people lived in, and of course the Democratic National Committee had its headquarters there, and that was what John Mitchell authorized to have bugged, right? Because they're bugging the offices of the Democratic candidates because they were running these smear campaigns, and they had espionage on them. They were just trying to to smear the Democrats, right? And they used all sorts of dirty tricks. One of them, they planned on using kidnapping and a variety of things. And John Mitchell, the Attorney General, authorized all of these things, right? He authorized all these, you know, all these illegal tactics. Now, it would not have, no one would have known, right, if in fact, so the plumbers, right, that's what they were known, the plumbers, they were arrested, was it June 17, 1972, right? June 17, 1972. They were, it just seemed like people, burglars, right, who were trying to get into the you know breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Watergate. So they were arrested, but of course, the people that were caught, it turned out that they were ex CIA, ex FBI, and they had links to the White House. So that was the main thing. The White House, they were trying to dissociate them from they were trying to, the White House was trying to sever all sorts of links to them, right? So the White House denied them. They didn't want to show that White House their connection to the president or the CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. So that was the cover up, right? That was a cover up. So um, and that's where investigative journalism came in. And Mark Felt, who was the number two guy at the FBI, who had been passed over for the number one spot, right? He had been a protege of J. Edgar Hoover. I've done a video regarding that. And so he started to leak information that he knew to the press, to two journalists, Washington Post journalists. That's um, Carl Bernstein and the Yale graduate uh, Bob Woodward, right? And there's a movie, All the President's Men. I've discussed this. And there's also a movie, Mark Felt. I discussed this in an earlier video. Now, so these journalists got dogged, and of course, they had Mark Felt, who was codenamed Deep Throat, and he was leaking information to the press, leaking information to them. And that's how they got to discover the slush fund, the money trail, the hush money. And so when the burglars were arrested, there was money set aside. John Mitchell, right, authorized some money, maybe like $1 million or so, to bribe the burglars so they were silent, so they didn't they didn't connect the president to the burglar, to the break-in. And of course, immediately, Richard Nixon denied it. Right? He said he didn't know anything about it. John Mitchell as well. When they asked him, he claimed he didn't know anything about it. He also denied it. So that was perjury. So of course, he was convicted for perjury. So these are very serious crimes, obstruction of justice. And then he tried to suppress the investigation as well, right? Obstruct because he was a former attorney general. He still had influence over the new attorney general. The new attorney general would resign. His name was Kleindienst, Kleindienst, right? Kleindienst. He has a German name. He took over. He succeeded John Mitchell as attorney general. But John Mitchell was, of course, chair uh, of Richard Nixon's campaign, even though he had stepped down as attorney general, but he was still controlling things, and he was now trying to cover up everything. He was severing um, ties and trying to cover up the links of the president and the White House uh, to the plumbers that had just been arrested and the Watergate break-in. Um, so they had the money trailed and they were paying and all that stuff. Unfortunately for him, his wife, who liked, she would drink, right? He enjoyed a nightcap. She would, have a couple of drinks, and then she would rifle through her husband's papers. She would eavesdrop on, because this was a tense period, and then she'd call her favorite reporters and start giving them information. His wife, her name was Martha Mitchell, and immediately starts saying, "Hey, her husband's just a patsy. He's just a fall guy. It's the president. It has nothing to do with her husband." And of course, that only got the press more dogged, more curious, right? So she was inadvertently giving the president, the press information, and it turns out that he would hire an FBI agent, Steve King, to actually kidnap the wife. And once she called, she was actually, so he kidnapped her, placed her in a hotel. And once she was making a call to the press, giving them information, the FBI agent yanked the phone cord right from the wall, so she couldn't speak. And so it just got the press more curious at what's going on. It's like she's being silenced. And then, they ordered, one of Nixon's personal lawyers would order a psychiatrist to drug her, to sedate her, to give her tranquilizers, to keep her silent. So this was actually going on. So, this is all illegal stuff. And I'll do another video and talk more about this, the kidnapping and Richard Nixon's response. So this was all shady stuff. But eventually, the press proved to be very dogged. And even though Richard Nixon won in one of the biggest presidential landslides, over 60%, he lost both houses, right? He didn't win either house. So both Congress, the House of Representatives and the US Senate were controlled by the Democrats. And of course, the Democrats then decided to have a committee, a Senate committee, investigating Watergate. And of course, the president was forced to appoint a special prosecutor, um, Archibald Cox, who had once been U.S. Solicitor General, and Nixon was trying to silence him. Of course, the smoking gun was the tapes. Nixon and John Mitchell had been denying any involvement, right, with Watergate, but it turns out that Richard Nixon had been secretly had he had installed a secret tape recording system of all White House conversations, all conversations of the White House, the Oval Office, and over White House phones as well. And so this got to the Watergate Senate committee and the press, and then the special prosecutor, and so they were asking for these tapes, and Nixon was refusing. Of course, that was a smoking gun, and Nixon was trying to get the special prosecutor fired. So that was obstruction of justice. They were all trying to get the special prosecutor fired because he wouldn't relent. He wouldn't just do a cosmetic, surface, rubber stamp investigation that would say, oh, there was no involvement, and just lied. He was trying to do a thorough job. And of course, uh, eventually, a number of attorney generals would resign, from Elliot Richardson, and then his deputy, and then Bill Ruckelshaus. They would all resign until he got the Solicitor General. That's Nixon. He got the Solicitor General, Bork, who would fire Archibald Cox. But eventually, in any event, Nixon was eventually forced to resign. Now, after Nixon resigned, they had enough information to prove the connection of Nixon and John Mitchell to the Watergate scandal. They found evidence of the slush money and everything that they had tried to silence, bribe the burglars to keep them quiet. There was evidence of all of that. And so on January the 1st, 1975, um, John Mitchell became the first attorney general to be convicted, right? He was the 67th attorney general and the first attorney general to be convicted for crimes committed in office. And so he was convicted. He was given initially 2 to 8 years. This was reduced to 1 to 4 years. He served 19 months at a federal prison in Montgomery, Alabama. The it was Maxwell Air Force Base. It was a minimum security prison. And interestingly, after he got out, um, he would die later on, right? He would die in 1988 from a heart attack. He died in the George Washington University Hospital, again associated with my school. Um, and interestingly, he was given full military honors. He was buried with full military honors at the Arlington National Cemetery, right, where we bury heroes. Even though he violated the Stolen Valor, but again, Stolen Valor Acts did not come up until 2013. He died before then. And so, in any event, that was the life of John Mitchell, the first attorney and only attorney general, U.S. attorney general, to be convicted for crimes perpetrated while in office and to be incarcerated, go to prison for those crimes. My name is Osha, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.